Ah, welcome, my good friend. You ask me what I am investigating. There is a young girl who has long captured my interest. You surely know of the 100 Years' War between England and France, do you not? A conflict fought across the 14th and well into the 15th century. An era of bloodshed lasting fully 116 years as the kingdoms of England and France tore each other apart over the crown and territory. But history textbooks, my friend, are invariably written to favor the victors. What I am examining is a singular, bizarre anomaly. At the very end of that war, back in the 1420s, when France was plunged into the deepest abyss of despair. And what was the state of France then? The vast majority of her lands had been trampled by the English army and their allies, the Burgundians, while the capital of Paris fell. The Dauphin Charles, who should have been the true king, fled southward to the Château de Chinon, where he cowered in fear, idling away his days, without even holding a coronation. The people of the court calculated on only one thing: how best to surrender or how to secure their own safety. The nation was entirely dead. Yet history is nothing if not ironic. Ignoring the calculations of a court sitting at the bottom of despair, a foreign body, one that would shatter the massive gears of fate, intruded from an entirely unexpected place. That girl is our subject today, Joan of Arc. How was it that she, a mere rustic peasant maid, came to lead the desperate armies of France and smash the English forces? The world prefers to dismiss this as a miracle or divine grace, but in my view, such facile words only serve to obscure the truth. Look closely at the maps and the records of that era. The village of Domremy, where she was born and raised, was by no means a secure inland haven of France. It was a frontline settlement, sharing its borders directly with the Burgundian lands, sworn enemies of the crown. Naturally, the children of the village, including Joan herself, may not have trembled with terror in every waking moment of their daily lives. Children are resilient creatures. No matter how ominous the air, they will still play and weave a semblance of ordinary life. On the surface, her girlhood must have been wrapped in the pastoral, commonplace scenery of any farming village. Yet we must not forget. No matter how peacefully the children enjoyed their days, just behind them, the relentless, inescapable footsteps of ruin crept ever closer. What was happening beyond the village? The murmurs of refugees, the grim faces of adults dreading pillage, and the suffocating air of a village that could be put to the torch at any moment. What sort of distortions, what kinds of shadows did those unseen gathering clouds cast upon the deep layers of a sensitive young girl's soul? The worldly assessment that she was merely a sheltered, ignorant country girl is, to my powers of observation, a blunder of the highest order. She was no mere simpleton, yet neither was she some born warrior, swinging a sword from the start. Then, beneath that veneer of calm, what on earth dealt the decisive fracture to her psyche? Why did she willfully cast herself into the bloody gears of destiny? What I am about to unravel is no tale of miracles. It is a cold, unsparing human drama concerning a nation sunk in despair and the trajectory of a single young girl's soul, drawn forth by the madness of an age. How a mere rural maiden was transformed into a monster bearing the fate of a nation. The key to solving that mystery does not lie solely within her personal inner self. To expose the other side of the affair, we must peer into the cold calculations of what the powers that be at the time were plotting. The French court of that era especially the footing of the Dauphin Charles, was literally a quagmire on the verge of collapse. As I mentioned earlier, he had been robbed of the capital of Paris and had holed up in the southern Château de Chinon. He had not yet undergone a formal coronation. In the strict ruling system of medieval Europe, without a consecrated crown upon his head, he was not a legitimate king, but merely one of many pretenders to the throne, or nothing more than an illegal squatter in the eyes of his enemies. What of the surrounding aides and military leaders? Day and night, they were engrossed in self-preservation and power struggles. Rather than how to counter the English army, they calculated solely on how their own lands and statuses might be protected should a total surrender occur. The morale of the army had plummeted to the depths of the earth, and the soldiers had grown thoroughly accustomed to defeat. By then, no one in the royal palace possessed the means to push back the English forces through conventional tactics. The nation was rotting from within. And who appeared amidst this? That very girl, Joan of Arc. To think of it with common sense, when a country peasant girl appeared at court claiming to have received divine revelation, the cold-hearted politicians and military men should naturally have dismissed her with a wave or tossed her into a dungeon as an eerie fanatic. Yet the people at Chinon did not do so. No, they could not. Because for them, it was already a case of a drowning man clutching at a straw. The power brokers of the court calculated in an instant. Whether she performs a genuine miracle or is merely a madwoman matters not. Might she not serve as the ultimate propaganda, a grand pretext to deceive the masses and overturn this desperate military situation? To rouse the soldiers once more, tactics were no longer enough. There was a need for an overwhelming symbol proclaiming that God has not abandoned us. If the girl insisted she had heard the voice of the archangel, they simply needed to fashion that claim into a state-sanctioned myth. By utilizing an ignorant girl, elevating her as a peculiar pawn and the mouthpiece of God, they could forcibly reboot the morale of the cowering populace and army. This was the profoundly calculating conclusion derived by the cornered intellects of the court. Yet, my friend, herein lies the greatest irony and the true mystery concealed within the labyrinth of history. The power brokers intended to use her as an ignorant, easily manipulated puppet molded entirely to their own convenience. However, that calculation would reveal a fatal flaw. The girl, who was supposed to be a mere puppet, began executing her divine mission with an earnestness too pure and an iron will far too intense. Those who sought to use her soon began to tremble before her overwhelming charisma and the fervor of the masses. Behind the quagmire of politics and the sheer scheming of mankind, the gears began to spin madly out of control, making a grinding sound. Now, once the staging orchestrated by the ruler's machinations was complete, what on earth was transpiring within the girl's heart? Let us peer into that abyss.
Now, let us finally proceed to the mystery of Joan of Arc. How was it that a mere peasant girl from a rural village could suddenly rise up and come to possess a will of steel? The world chooses to idolize her as a saint favored by God, while cynical later-day critics attempt to dismiss her as the mere byproduct of a clever political device. Yet my powers of observation will tolerate no such facile conclusions. For behind every action, there exists the precise, clockwork motivation, known as the human heart. First, let us look back at the environment of her hometown, the village of Domremy, which served as her psychological foundation. As I mentioned earlier, it was a front line on the border, brimming with the constant tension that enemy soldiers might descend upon them at any moment. What made the 100 Years' War such a tragedy for France was that every single battleground lay within French soil. The children may have been enjoying their daily lives, but the sensitive skin of a receptive young girl must have absorbed the microscopic particles of terror floating in the air. The footsteps of destruction,
the faces of frightened adults, food and livestock plundered, homes burned to the ground, and the reality of her homeland trampled without reason. All of this sank deeply into the layers of her subconscious, becoming a magma of overwhelming rage against the absurdity of it all. Consider her age here, if you will. The period from 16 to 19 is an age of supreme sensitivity in a human life, a dangerously pure time when one internalizes the suffering of others as if it were one's own. Adults averted their eyes from reality for the sake of self-preservation, and everyone had given up in despair. What transpired within her mind at that very moment? Why does no one attempt to stop this unreasonable violence? Why has God abandoned this world? That simple, intense question sparked a dramatic chemical reaction within a state of extreme psychological stress. Yes, it was the voice of the Archangel Michael, which she is said to have heard. The world is eager to believe this was the manifestation of a miracle, but viewed from the perspective of psychology, it was nothing more than a defense mechanism for the human mind to survive, born of extreme environmental stress, and a system of unconscious self-indoctrination to establish a sacred legitimacy within herself. For a powerless peasant girl to step forth into a male-dominated society and the tumultuous seas of warfare, she desperately needed an absolute indulgence to justify herself. She was not manipulated by anyone, rather, using the voice echoing from the abyss of her own psyche as a medium, she redefined herself as the mouthpiece of God. It was no modern platitude like patriotism. What drove her forward was the terror of watching her familiar world destroyed and the inescapable obsession of a sense of mission that if someone did not stand up, everything would be trampled underfoot. Unless she sublimated her terror into a form of madness, she could never have endured the cruel reality of that age. The men of the court, who sought to use her through cold calculation, had no inkling whatsoever of the fathomless depths of this young girl's terrifyingly pure madness. What they intended to manipulate was a mere doll, but what they actually unleashed was an overwhelming flame that would burn the very era to ashes. Now, where did that flame head, and why did it meet such a cruel end? Are you ready to open the final door, my friend?
Now, let us head toward the grand finale. Having achieved the glorious liberation of Orléans and safely guided the Dauphin to the Cathedral of Reims, Joan of Arc reached the absolute zenith of her glory as the mouthpiece of God. Yet the conclusion of her tale was profoundly cruel and served to strip bare the ugliest nature of mankind. The world prefers to brush off her end as the result of a ruthless English conspiracy. To be sure, those who judged her after her capture were ecclesiastical forces under English influence, and there is no doubt that political liquidation was their aim. But tell me, can the full scope of this tragedy be explained by that alone? My powers of observation refuse to overlook the maneuvers of the French side instead. Those who elevated her to a hero and desired her death above all others were none other than the French populace and the very power brokers who ought to have been saved by her. Just consider it, if you will. To a populace exhausted by a protracted war, Joan was at first a miracle savior. However, human beings are creatures incapable of enduring the burden of depending on others for their own salvation indefinitely. As the military situation stalled and the illusion of miracles began to fade by degrees, what transpired within the hearts of the masses? Why can we not win, even with her here? Could it be that this woman's power is not a divine blessing, but rather the sorcery of the demons? Yes, fanatical adoration, swung by a mere hair's breadth into its opposite, transforming into a violent hatred and a madness that craved a scapegoat. Furthermore, to the church and the intelligentsia of that era, The notion of a mere peasant girl directly hearing the voice of God and moving kings and armies was, to the existing religious and social order, a terrifying, supreme threat. If individual intuition or direct communion with God were permitted, the very reason for being of the privileged clergy class would be shaken to its foundations. That is precisely why they passionately desired a trial, to judge her as a heretic, and sought to justify her guilty verdict and execution with their own hands. And the coldest of all was the attitude of the Dauphin, who had finally achieved his coronation and become the rightful King Charles VII. Though she was the greatest benefactor who had once placed him upon the throne, when she was captured, he did nothing, neither paying a ransom nor sending a single rescue force. Why? The answer is painfully clear. To him now, wearing the consecrated crown, the overwhelming charisma of the divine girl was nothing more than an impediment, threatening his own legitimacy. A once useful saint had to be wiped from the earth as swiftly as possible for the sake of political stability. In the year 1431, in the Vieux Marché of Rouen, with what expressions did the French populace look up at her figure standing amidst the raging flames of the pyre? A crowd gripped by fear, relief, or perhaps shouting, "Burn the witch!" as if to banish their own complicity. The fire consumed far more than the physical body of a single young girl. It laid bare the thoroughly hideous truth of human society itself, which sold out justice for the sake of self-preservation and offered up its savior as a sacrifice. Tracing the mystery of Joan of Arc leaves only this within my hands: the cold, unsparing fact of a young girl's tragic end and the unfathomable darkness lurking within the human heart. Deep within the labyrinth known as history, mankind repeats the very same errors and dramas in every single age.